The God's Peculiar People podcast presents a recording of the life of D.L. Moody by his son, William R. Moody. The Life of D.L. Moody, Chapter 30. The Bible Institute for Home and Foreign Missions. A letter is on file at the Women's Department of the Institute that intimates Mr. Moody's thoughts regarding the school. East Northfield, Massachusetts, December 16th, 1895. My dear Miss Strong, I want to get my two granddaughters into the women's department the first of the year 1916. They will be about the same age, and I would be glad to have them room together. I want them to understand how to visit from house to house. You might have their names put down, so that if the building is full at the commencement of the fall term, they will not be crowded out. Their names are Irene Moody, born at Mount Hermon, August 22nd, 1895, and Emma Moody Fitt, born at East Northfield, December 16th. It is my wish that when they have gotten through the Northfield Seminary, they spend 2 years at the Bible Institute, and as I have taken some interest in the society, I hope you will give my application a favorable consideration. I do not ask for a free scholarship, I only want to make sure to get them in. I should like to have them do some housework. I find it is so much better for young ladies to care for a house, so if they ever have one of their own, they will know how to look after it. Yours truly, D.L. Moody. I believe we have got to have gapmen, men who are trained to stand between the laity and the ministers, was a common expression of Mr. Moody's. He felt the great need for more lay Christian workers. On the one hand, he found many consecrated men and women ready and anxious to do God's will, and on the other hand he saw that there was plenty of opportunity for them to do work, if they only had the necessary skill and training. His effort was to solve this problem, and he made urgent appeals for funds wherewith to open a training school. Responses to this appeal came heartily. The money was pledged, the preliminary steps were taken, and a new enterprise was chartered under the name of the Chicago Evangelization Society. On December 31st, 1886, Mr. Moody began a 4 months campaign of evangelistic services in Chicago, going from one church to another and utilizing the great roller skating rinks. Every noon a large meeting was held at Old Farwell Hall, the audience room of the Young Men's Christian Association building, which had been the scene of many former experiences in Mr. Moody's life. Each Monday, noon reports were heard from the various churches and missions. During these 4 months, plans for the training school, as it was then called, were being brought into shape, but unexpected hindrances appeared. At the last noon meeting of his stay, Mr. Moody asked, "How shall this work be carried on when I am gone?" And someone called out, "Get a tent." "All right," said Mr. Moody, "I'll give the first $100. Who next?" Money was at once raised for the object, and the gospel tent, 80 feet in diameter, was secured and pitched in a district so wicked it was known as Little Hell. The tent was manned by an evangelist with a corps of assistants, Bibles in hand. After a few weeks, the tent was moved elsewhere, and so, summer and winter, the meetings went on, the winter services being held in churches, missions, and theaters, and the summer meetings in the tent. The barroom of a small theater was once used as an inquiry room, with beer kegs for seats. Multitudes were brought to Christ from the lowest strata of society, and thus was found one solution of the problem: how shall we reach the masses? Training was given the workers in a series of brief Bible institutes, when excellent Bible teachers expounded the Scriptures and gave practical methods of Christian work. In May 1889, the institute was held in the Chicago Avenue Church, and Mr. Moody found nearly 200 people present when he had looked for 20. As a result of that conference, the Chicago Bible Institute was formed and formally opened in the fall of that year. Land and buildings adjoining the Chicago Avenue Church was purchased at an outlay of $55,000. The 3 dwellings on La Salle Avenue, included in the original purchase, were fitted up for the home of the women's department, to which 3 others, costing $36,000, have since been added. On Institute Place, $50,000 was expended in the erection of a 3-story brick building, 100 by 125 feet in dimensions, built about a hollow square, having the rare advantage in the heart of a closely built region of light and air on all sides. 2 more stories were added just before the World's Fair, at an additional cost of $15,000. This building contains the necessary classrooms, offices, and dormitories for 200 men, with dining hall, kitchens, and laundry. Over $20,000 was spent in furnishing the various departments. The Institute was formally opened with a week's conference, beginning September 26, 1889, and the Reverend Mr. Torrey, superintendent of the Congregational City Missionary Society of Minneapolis, a graduate of Yale College and Seminary, and who had also studied at the universities of Leipzig and Erlangen, was called to the position of superintendent. Students have come to the Institute from all quarters. Till today, there is not a race and but few nations which are not represented on its register. The system embraces a thorough doctrinal, analytical, and book study of the English Bible under the tuition of resident instructors. Added to this, lectures are given by the best Bible teachers from both sides of the water on topics to which they have individually given the closest attention. While spiritual exposition is emphasized, all is based upon the most careful and scholarly study of the Word. 2 years of 12 months each are required for the course, but as it proceeds in a circle, students can enter at any time and by remaining 2 years complete the full course. Mr. Moody always recognizes the power of gospel song, and no education for Christian service would be complete in his eyes without it. Hence, a musical department was necessary. Those gifted in that direction received careful training in the art of singing the gospel, a branch of vocal culture to which special attention is not usually given. The morning hours are spent in the classroom, and the afternoons and evenings are divided between study and practical work among the unconverted. Rescue mission work, house-to-house visitation, children's meetings, women's meetings, jail work, inquiry meeting work, church visitation. Each form of effort which can be developed in the heart of a great and wicked city is here supplied. For several years, 2 and 3 large tents have been utilized during the summer, and many street meetings are held. When cold weather approaches, the people interested are gathered into cottage meetings, varying in attendance from 8 to 50. At one time, 35 cottage meetings were being held each week. The result of the first decade's work of the Institute strongly testified to its success. In this time, several thousand have been in attendance, of which number 202 are in home, city, and rescue missions, 180 in evangelistic work as preachers and singers, 38 in educational and philanthropic work, 64 are superintendents of city missions, 368 are pastors, pastors' assistants, and church visitors, 58 are Sunday school missionaries, 25 are Christian Association secretaries, 22 are coal porters, and 186 are foreign missionaries. The institution at present owns land and buildings which exceed $300,000 in value. It is cosmopolitan in character, receiving students of many tribes and nations from beyond our shores, and sending out men and women with the message of the gospel to all lands. The Bible Institute has been called the West Point of Christian work. It endeavors to embody all the principles which characterize successful Christian workers. Study and work go hand in hand. Mr. Moody's desire to place deserving students in training for Christian effort both in Chicago and Northfield, and at the same time give consecrated men and women of wealth an opportunity to share in this work, is seen from the following letters sent to trusted friends in New York. My dear, can or will you and your wife take one student each in our school out here for $18.91? It will only cost $150 each, and they can report to you every 30 days how they are doing. I have found a good many who have gone through college or seminary, especially ladies, who have no money, for they have spent all at school and have nothing to come here. But $150 will keep them hard at work for 365 days, and they will do much good, and will be learning all the time. My wife and I are each going to take one, and I'm going to see if I cannot get 200 others to do the same, and then it will not come heavy on any of us. I am thankful to tell you that I have not found our church in such good condition for 14 years. God is using this society to stir up the city. They had the grandest summer that Chicago has seen for many years, and I am in hopes of keeping things moving. I shall want to start in with the workers in 1891, and if you can see your way clear to come in with us, I should be glad. Under the date of February 24th, 1890, he wrote to a friend relative to the work of the institution as follows. I am thankful to tell you that I have some splendid men and women in the field. My schoolwork will not tell much until the century closes, but when I am gone, I shall leave some grand men and women behind. I am thankful to tell you that I am gaining all the time on the endowment. I hope you will give me the lever. If you cannot, do not cut me off from your list of beggars. 3 special classes of student whose needs the Institute especially aims to meet may be briefly mentioned. 1. Graduates of college or theological seminaries who wish to supplement the valuable education received at those schools by a thorough study of the English Bible and methods of aggressive Christian work. Ministers, evangelists, returned missionaries, and other Christian workers who have had actual experience in the field and who wish to give some time to further study and preparation for larger usefulness. Men and women who do not intend to devote their entire time to gospel work, but who desire a larger acquaintance with the Bible and methods of the Christian effort. While pursuing their secular callings, they may also work intelligently and successfully in winning others to Christ. A week before Mr. Moody's health broke down, he was pointedly asked, Do you consider the Bible Institute a success? If you were to start over again, would you follow the same plan? Yes, he replied. It has been a great success and a wonderful blessing. I would do the same again. The preceding winter, when he was in Colorado, he wrote, "It is cheering to come out here and find our boys doing so grandly. It pays for all we have done, and I feel as if I wanted to do far more in the future. It is a blessed thing to just put live men into the world, for they set others to work." In further testimony to the practical nature of his ideas as embodied in the Institute, it is only necessary to state that institutions on precisely similar lines have sprung up in various parts of the land. Toronto, Canada, and Glasgow, Scotland, sent representatives to Chicago to study the institution, and now both cities have Bible institutes after Mr. Moody's model. He lived to see his ideas move among prominent educators. For more study of the English Bible, and systematic practical instruction of the precise nature that Mr. Moody has given his students for the past 10 years, are the two main reforms that President Charles Cuthbert Hall, President Harper, and others are seeking to bring about in theological seminaries. The Life of D.L. Moody, Chapter 31. Among College Students. Whatever success had attended Mr. Moody's missions in large cities, and whatever influence he had acquired over thinking men as individuals, working in the college community was the one field for which he considered himself preeminently unfitted. The college spirit is by its very training extremely critical. Inaccuracies of speech are quickly detected, and an attitude of reverence rarely distinguishes the average student. This was perfectly apparent to Mr. Moody, and for some time he avoided and declined college invitations. Occasionally he had accepted invitations to Yale or Princeton, and the results had been deeply gratifying. But there was ever present the feeling that his mission was not to those whose educational privileges had been so much greater than his own. In this estimate of a college audience, Moody was doubtless correct, but he made one serious error, owing to his ignorance of the deeper life of the student body. Critical it truly is, but deep below the superficial criticism of the student is an appreciation of genuine sincerity that is equaled by few audiences. Let college men be convinced of a speaker's real worth and unflinching courage, and he will receive a more sympathetic response than from most audiences. This explains largely the influence Mr. Moody exerted upon the religious life of many institutions of learning, where the direct and fearless deliverance of his message was eagerly received, with evident results. And if he won a cordial response from the student body, it was because of the thorough sympathy existing between audience and speaker. For if the colleges heard him gladly, Mr. Moody certainly enjoyed addressing young men more than any other class. The first important work among students began in Cambridge, England, during his mission in Great Britain in 1883-84. As has already been stated, Mr. Moody on a few occasions had visited some of the American colleges, notably Princeton in 1876 and Yale in 1878, with most gratifying results, but it was in England that he was truly introduced to the student world. The notable indication of Mr. Moody's change of attitude was his response to the petitions of the students of Cambridge and Oxford to visit their universities. Among those who were greatly interested in this work, and by their influence contributed largely to its success, were Mr. J.E.K. Studd and Mr. W.H. Stone, at that time undergraduates. The latter, now the Reverend W.H. Stone, M.A., Vicar of St. Mary's, Kilburn, thus describes in a recent letter the mission to the University of Cambridge. There lies before me a little book with this inscription: To my friend, W.H. Stone, D.L. Moody, Cambridge, November 12, 1882. And now, after 17 years, that book seems to recall with wondrous vividness the incidents of that memorable week. On returning to Cambridge after the long vacation, I was invited by J.E.K. Studd and the Cambridge Christian Union to join the subcommittee in carrying out the arrangements for a mission conducted by Mr. Moody at the invitation of the Union. The corn exchange was secured for the Sunday evening meetings, and the gymnasium in Market Passage, now the Conservative Club, for the weekday meetings. A large choir of university men met regularly under the direction of G.E. Morgan of St. John's to practice those hymns which were likely to be required. A committee, including members from nearly all the colleges, handed a personal invitation to every undergraduate member of the university. The daily prayer meeting was well attended by all the men. All was now ready, and on Sunday evening, November 5th, we proceeded to the first meeting in the corn exchange. The great building and annex had been seated to hold some 2,500 people. On the platform, in front of the chair, was the Reverend H.G. S. Mole, John Barton, James Lang, Henry Trotter, and a few others. 1,700 men in cap and gown were counted entering the building. Each one was provided with a hymn book. In they came, laughing and talking and rushing for seats near their friends. Little attention seemed to be paid to the preliminary hymn singing of the choir. A firecracker thrown against the window caused some disturbance. Then Mr. Moody asked the clergyman on the platform to pray. But men shouted "Hear, hear" instead of "Amen," and Sankey's first solo was received with jeers and loud demands for an encore. The reading of the scripture was frequently interrupted. Mr. Moody's address was almost unheard by reason of the chaffing questions and noises which came from all parts of the exchange. Still, the evangelist persevered with the most perfect good temper, until a lull in the storm enabled him for 5 minutes to plead with those who honor their mother's God to remain for a short prayer meeting. After the singing of another hymn, during which many left the building, some 400 remained for a brief prayer meeting, amongst whom many of the rowdiest men were seen to be quiet, impressed, and apparently ashamed of their recent behavior. With heavy hearts we took our way to our respective colleges, but Mr. Moody seemed undaunted and full of hope for the ultimate success of the mission. On Monday we assembled in the gymnasium, and the sight was enough to depress the spirits of the most sanguine, for only 100 came to the meeting. After the address, Mr. Moody spake to every man in the building. When, on asking a man if he were a Christian, he received the answer, "No, but I wish to be one," we saw that the effect was not to be in vain, for on that night, one who was afterwards thrown in the varsity boat, and then to become a missionary in Japan, decided to serve the Lord Christ. A few more on Tuesday night. On Wednesday, a letter appeared in the University Review, written by J.E.K. Studd, reminding the members of the university that Messrs. Moody and Sankey had been invited by certain undergraduates to conduct the mission, and that they were entitled to the treatment usually extended to invited guests. This letter had an excellent effect throughout Cambridge, and some 200 came to the evening meeting. On Thursday night, Mr. Moody gathered a meeting of some 300 mothers of the town of Cambridge in the Alexander Hall to pray for university men as some mother sons. Mr. Moody described this meeting as unique in his long experience. Mother after mother, amidst her tears, pleaded for the young men of the university. That night the tide turned. Who that was privileged to witness it will ever forget the scene? I may remind old Cambridge men that there is a gallery in the gymnasium used as a fencing room, and approached by a long flight of steps from the gymnasium below. The preacher's subject was the marriage supper of the Lamb. At the close of his address, he asked any who intended to be present at that marriage supper to rise and go up into the gallery. Terrible test. Amidst an awful stillness, a young Trinity man arose, faced the crowd of men, and deliberately ascended the stairs. In a moment, scores of men were on their feet, following him to that upper room. Many that night made the great decision. Some of the men who then received the Lord Jesus Christ as their personal Savior are known to me today as honored servants of God in positions of great importance. On Friday night there was an increased audience, but no meeting on Saturday. What would happen on the last Sunday night was the question in everyone's mind. 1,800 men assembled in the corn exchange for the final service. In perfect stillness the great gathering listened to a simple address on the gospel of Christ. The annex was arranged for the after meeting, and 162 men gave in their names at the close as desirous of receiving a little book which might prove useful to those who were seeking to know the power of the gospel of Christ. Many men came to see Moody at his hotel, some to criticize, some to apologize for the unseemly behavior of the first night, and some to receive that help he was so fitted by God to give to those who were seeking the way of peace. The impress of this mission still rests upon the religious life of Cambridge. Its influence is felt in many parishes at home, and in many of the dark places of heathendom. No one who took any part in this mission could have been tempted to glorify the human agents or ascribe its success to them. It was the work of God. Mr. Moody had none of those qualifications which would mark him as specially fitted to influence the members of an English university. Unlettered and ignorant of the customs of university men, by the power of God which rested upon him, he accomplished a work which no adequate account will be given until the day of Christ. From Cambridge the evangelist went to Oxford. The mission opened on Monday evening, November 13th, with a general meeting in the Corn Exchange. The crowd speedily overflowed that building, and more than filled the hall close by. As Moody began to read a chapter from the book of Ezekiel, some of the audience began to stamp and shout, "Hear, hear!" Mr. Moody immediately closed his Bible and rebuked them sharply. "You had better play with forked lightning, or meddle with the most deadly disease," he said, "than trifle with the word of God." He then asked those men to rise who wished him to continue, and the whole assembly, with the exception of a few young men, instantly did so. The result was striking and effective, and there was no more interruptions during the evening. The second and third evenings there was still a manifest intention to make fun of the services. The second evening Mr. Moody preached on repentance, and the third night on sowing and reaping. He had not proceeded far in his discourse on Wednesday evening before it was evident, from the audible adverse criticisms, that there were many present who were not inclined to give the speaker a fair hearing. A large company returning from a champagne dinner attended the meeting, and their boisterous conduct made it difficult for the speaker to be heard. Hymns were applauded, and derisive amens accompanied the prayers. This company, intent on mischief, attended the second meeting for the students, and undertook to break it up. Mr. Moody found himself in the midst of a group of young men, most of whom had been among the disturbers on the previous occasion. With that readiness of resource which so often stood him in good stead, he seized the opportunity, and proceeded in the plainest, though most courteous terms, to tell the young men what he thought of them and their reprehensible conduct. Addressing them simply as those who, like himself, would lay claim to the title of gentleman, he said that they owed him an apology for the treatment which he had received at their hands. He had been invited by their fellow students to come and speak to them, and the least they could have done would have been to give him a respectful hearing. "I have always heard of the proverbial love of the English gentleman for fair play," he said. "As an invited guest to Oxford, I expected at least to receive a fair chance to be heard. I am here at the invitation of your fellow collegians, and your condition after a champagne supper is the only explanation I can give of your conduct." The inference was too much, and several demanded if Mr. Moody meant to say that they were drunk. "Well, gentlemen, I can only say that the less said about that, the better. The wine supper seems to me to be the most charitable explanation of your conduct. Now," he said in conclusion, "you owe me an apology, and to show you I mean it, I expect that you will be present at the meeting tomorrow night, and give me a fair hearing." They assented to all he said, and offered a verbal apology for having so transgressed the rules of common civility. Mr. Moody accepted their apology as far as he was concerned, but he said they ought to make further reparations by taking prominent seats in the meeting the next night, and listening quietly to his remarks. The result entirely justified his line of action. Having thoroughly earned their personal respect, he succeeded in gaining a hearing for the message he had to deliver, and the next night the band was present in full force, taking prominent seats and giving the closest attention throughout. From this time the strength of the opposition was broken, and on the following evening the Clarendon Assembly Room had become too small for the growing numbers of undergraduates that attended, and they met in the town hall. Mr. Moody's subject was the value of moral courage in a bold confession of Christ before men, and many instances from the Scriptures illustrated this. Having dismissed the first meeting, and gathered a large number of men near the platform, Mr. Moody mounted one of the seats and adopted a more colloquial form of address. "It will be cross to you," he said, "to confess Christ tonight, but the best thing to do is to take it up. If you intend to see the kingdom of God, you will have to take it up the cross. It would never be easier than now. Whosoever therefore shall confess me before men, him I will confess before my Father which is in heaven." Think of Jesus Christ confessing you and saying, "This is my disciple." Is there not someone here who is willing to take up the cross and to say right out, "I will"? One voice sounding forth a response gave courage to others, and a stream of "I wills" came thick and fast. "Thank God," said Moody. "I like those 'I wills.' Young men, you don't know how cheering it is. It is worth a whole lifetime of toil. This is joy that fills me full. Thank God for giving you courage to speak out. Is there not another here who will take a bold stand for Christ? Perhaps some of you will say, 'Why can't I do it at home?' So you can, but it is a good thing to do it here. I remember the first time I stood up to testify for Christ. My knees smote together, and I trembled from head to foot. My thoughts left me. I spoke a few words and then sat down. But I got such a blessing in my soul that it followed me until now. It helps a man wonderfully to take a bold stand, and let the world, both friends and enemies, know that you are on the Lord's side. It is so easy to serve him after you have taken your stand. If a number of you were to come right out for God together, you would change the whole tone of this university. I could stand all night and hear those 'I wills.' They are about the sweetest thing one can hear outside of heaven." Mr. Moody had taken a strong stand from the outset, and he knew that he had won the day. It would have been easy to stop here, but those who knew him could not expect to have the matter end simply with a confession of Christ. He hazarded a further test, though he said he had some hesitation in doing it. He suggested that those sitting on the first 3 seats in the front should vacate them, and those who had just spoken should come, and kneeling there, dedicate themselves to the Lord. The request was scarcely uttered before some 5 or 6 rows were filled with a solid row of kneeling figures. "We have seen a good many of Mr. Moody's and other evangelistic meetings," wrote a correspondent for the Christian, "but if we could trust our memory, we have never seen any like this. The power of God seems to be present in such a degree that these young men, many of them the flower of the rising intellect of our land, seem to be swayed at his will, like the ripe standing corn before the breezes of heaven. We could but exclaim in our hearts, 'It is the Lord's doing, and it is marvelous in our eyes.'" In the mission which followed in London during the succeeding winter, many of Mr. Moody's most efficient helpers came from the universities visited at this time. Doubtless this did much to influence him in his work among students, and his special interest in the Young Men's Christian Association student work dates from this period. His cooperation in this effort was enlisted early in its history, and for several years he raised by personal solicitation the necessary funds for the support of this department of the work. It was in response to his earnest appeal that J.E.K. Studd of England and Henry Drummond visited the leading American colleges in the winter of 1886 and the fall of 1887. In the establishment of the Northfield Students' Conference, Mr. Moody contributed as largely in any other way to the religious life of the American colleges. In the winter of 1886, while traveling in the southern states, he met one of the early secretaries of the college department of the Young Men's Christian Association, and in conversation regarding the needs of the work, Mr. Moody urged a greater prominence of Bible study among students. The counter-suggestion was then made that he should give a daily course of Bible instruction to a number of college men during the month of July, to which he acceded, on a condition that the management of the details of the entertainment of the guests should be assumed by the secretaries of the association. Plans were made at once for the first of these gatherings of students, which have since become so prominent a feature of the Northfield work. The invitation to Northfield met with an acceptance far more general than had been anticipated, and it was decided to hold the meetings at the Mount Hermon Boys' School during the month of July. On July 7th, the conference opened with an attendance of 250 students, representing 80 colleges in 25 states. Mr. Moody presided at the morning meeting, which was devoted to Bible study, in which informal teaching was given the preference over regular discourse. Questions were freely asked and answered. The afternoons were given up to athletic sports and quiet study, either alone or in groups. Particular tenderness of feeling prevailed during the closing days of the meeting. The most prominent outward results of this conference was the attention given to foreign missions. Sons of missionaries and natives from foreign lands spoke at some of the meetings, and before the conference broke up, nearly 100 students announced their intention to become foreign missionaries whenever fitted and required. From this small beginning, the student volunteer movement has grown to be recognized as one of the strongest factors in the missionary work of the church today. Although he was deeply interested in the missionary cause, as the results of his work everywhere show, the volunteer movement did not at first receive Mr. Moody's endorsement. The enthusiasm of the leaders he felt to be unwise, as it brought undue pressure to bear upon young people, and led them to decide impulsively to pledge themselves to a work which no one should enter upon without the clearest call, not from man only, but directly from God. His attitude was invariably consistent. All that could be urged upon anyone was willingness to do what God called him to do. But as he himself expressed it is a great pity for young men to place themselves under a privilege to enter any form of Christian work before God calls them, and he never calls a man until he is ready. The wisdom of this has since been recognized by many ardent students of missions, and the large number of unfulfilled pledges and candidates unadapted to missionary endeavor testify to his knowledge of the human nature. The success of this conference at Mount Hermon School effectively dissipated Mr. Moody's doubt of his call to work for the colleges, and he heartily agreed to repeat the Northfield Conference the next year. From this time, he frequently conducted evangelistic meetings in colleges, and further manifested his interest in Christian work for the support of the administrative work of the Students' Christian Association. The attendance has steadily increased at these gatherings, and now there are about 700 registered delegates each year. In addition to this, there are nearly as many guests come to Northfield especially to attend the platform meetings, which are open to all. Missionaries from many countries, presidents and professors of colleges, pastors of leading churches, and other Christian workers address the students, who gather from nearly every leading college and university in this country, Canada, and Great Britain. And such speakers as Henry Drummond, John Mott, Robert E. Spear, Alexander Mackenzie, R.A. Torrey, Francis L. Patton, and Henry Clay Trumbull have been prominent at these annual gatherings in past years. The Life of D.L. Moody, Chapter 32. Northfield Conferences. The Northfield Christian Workers' Conference, or as it was more commonly known, the Northfield Bible Conference, to distinguish it from the Students' Conference held in the month of July, was the first of the summer gatherings assembled at Mr. Moody's home. This conference is of special interest as it expresses the spiritual development of the leader himself during the last 20 years of his ministry, and has proved to be one of the most permanent results that he achieved for the Christian church. In making Northfield his home, Mr. Moody had a twofold object in view. As a father, he was always watchful of the physical as well as the moral welfare of his children. In the wholesome country life to which he had himself laid the foundations of a rugged constitution, he hoped to have his children equally benefited. The quiet of a small New England village, he thought, would also give him ample time for study, which he could not pursue while actively engaged in missions. And so, to bring about these two results, he decided to spend a few weeks each summer in his native town, at the same time visiting his mother. But public services had become second nature to him, and even during this short season of relaxation, he was soon arranging meetings. On Sundays he was usually away from home, preaching in neighboring towns, and the sight of Mr. Moody, driving his old gray horse, Nellie Gray, was a familiar one to all the villages within a radius of 25 miles of Northfield. He was also a regular attendant at the midweek prayer meetings, helping to build up the local church in every way. During the second summer spent there, he began a series of informal Bible readings, to which the neighbors were invited. These gatherings were held in his own house, and the attendance would frequently more than fill the limited accommodations of his dining room, numbers standing outside on the verandas by the open windows. Usually he would conduct these meetings himself, although sometimes a prominent visitor would be called upon to speak. In the spring of 1880, Dr. William Blakey of Edinburgh visited Mr. Moody, and a week's series of Bible readings were at once arranged to be held in the new recitation hall, now Revel Hall, of the Northfield Seminary. There was only occasional indications of a deeper purpose, probably very indefinite in his own mind at the time, but ultimately to find expression in the establishment of the Northfield Bible Conferences. In November of 1879, he began an evangelistic mission in Cleveland, Ohio. The customary conference for Christian workers was held at the close of the series of evangelistic meetings, at which time the Reverend H.B. Hartzell gave an address on prayer for the church, which deeply impressed Mr. Moody, who sat immediately in front of the speaker. As Mr. Hartzell proceeded, Mr. Moody bowed his head in deep meditation for a time. Then, as if some plan of action had suddenly commanded itself, he raised his head, flashed one quick glance at Mr. Hartzell, and resumed his position. At the close of the service, he at once drew Mr. Hartzell aside to the pastor's study, and abruptly announced, "I want you to come to Northfield next summer. Will you? I want to have a meeting to wait on God, and want you." This was rather too sudden for the other, who could not make an engagement so far ahead. On August 4th of the following year, however, he received the following letter. Northfield, Massachusetts. Dear Mr. Hartzell, enclosed you will find a circular that will explain itself. The call for the first conference. I got a start towards it in your city when you spoke at the convention there about November 1st. Now will you come? I want you above any other man in this nation. Do not say me nay, but come and let us wait on God together. Yours truly, D. Moody. Call entitled A Convocation of Prayer was as followed. Feeling deeply this great need, and believing that its reward is in reserve for all who honestly seek it, a gathering is hereby called to meet in Northfield, Massachusetts, from September 1st to 10 inclusive, the object of which is not so much to study the Bible, though the Scriptures will be searched daily for instruction and promises, as for solemn consecration, for pleading God's promises, and waiting upon Him for a fresh anointment of power from on high. Not a few of God's chosen servants from our own land and from over the sea will be present to join with us in prayer and counsel. All ministers and laymen, and those women who are helpers and laborers together with us in the kingdom and patience of our Lord Jesus Christ, and indeed all Christians who are hungry for an intimate fellowship with God and for His power to do His work, are most cordially invited to assemble with us. It is also hoped that those Christians whose hearts are united with us in desire for this new endowment of power, but who cannot be present, will send us salutation and greeting by letter, that there may be concert of prayer with them throughout the land during these days of waiting. D. Moody. Mr. Hartzell accepted the invitation, and was urged by Mr. Moody to assume charge and preside at all the meetings. With this request, probably the only one he ever refused, Mr. Moody, he positively declined to comply, and Mr. Moody was obliged to assume the leadership himself. In later years, Mr. Hartzell became one of his most valuable helpers in Northfield, both in the Mount Hermon School and at the several Northfield Conferences. And Mr. Moody often referred in terms of warmest appreciation to the convention in Cleveland where he first met this friend. Over 300 visitors responded to the first call. Those who could not be accommodated in East Hall, the one dormitory building at the Northfield Seminary at this time, filled the recitation building, and crowded the astonished town, some camping out in tents wherever a sheltered corner was to be found. The village church was scarcely large enough for a meeting place, and a large tent was pitched behind Mr. Moody's house. The second convention was held the year following. Then, owing to Mr. Moody's campaign in Great Britain, there was an interval of 3 years. But since a third gathering in 1885, they have been held without interruption every successive year during the early part of August. The meetings of the first conference were largely devotional, study being directed especially to the doctrine of the Holy Spirit. Many prayers were offered in behalf of the new institutions in Northfield, designed, as they were, to be distinctly a place of Christian nurture and a training school for Christian laborers. The meetings proved most impressive and fruitful. It is safe to say that in modern times no such gathering as the first Northfield Conference has been witnessed, writes Mr. Hartzell. Like the Jerusalem Pentecost, there were present devout men out of every nation under heaven. America, Europe, Asia, and Africa had their representatives. It was interesting to find brethren there from almost every state in the Union, from Mexico, Canada, England, Scotland, Wales, South Africa, Athens, Smyrna, Cappadocia, and many other lands and cities, pastors and evangelists, professors and editors, elders and deacons, devout women, earnest youth, and all with one accord in one place. Another remarkable feature of the convocation was the widespread interest and sympathy with the object of the gathering, which was manifested in hundreds of letters and telegrams that came pouring in from all parts of this and other lands. Mr. Moody began to receive these communications weeks before the meetings opened, and they kept coming by scores, even to the closing day. Christian associations, colleges, young ladies' seminaries, churches, camp meetings, women's prayer meetings, individual ministers and laymen, and almost every class and condition of Christian people were in communication with those present. It is especially noticeable that a large proportion of the letters were from ministers of the various denominations. At the close of the 9th day, there were more than 3,000 requests for prayers piled up on Mr. Moody's desk. He had held them until that time, feeling that those present needed first to draw near to God, in prevailing prayer for themselves before they began to pray for others. He learned also that the meetings for the same object were being held in a number of places. He had no programs for the meetings. At first he took no leading part in the speaking, calling others to the front, but finally he yielded to the general desire to hear him and preach 2 or 3 sermons on the Holy Spirit. The main object of the conference, as set forth in the call, was so manifestly approved of God that it was steadily kept in view from beginning to end. The object was solemn self-consecration, pleading God's promises, and waiting on Him for a fresh anointing and power from on high. "Don't think of your homes, your families, your work, or your churches now," said Mr. Moody at one of the meetings. "Don't pray for anything or anybody but yourself. Attend now to your own heart only." One day a man arose who said that he had been 5 years on the Mount of Transfiguration. Mr. Moody cast a quick glance upon the speaker and flashed into his face a sharp question. "How many souls did you lead to Christ last year?" "Well, I don't know," was the astonished reply. "Have you saved any?" I don't know that I have," answered the man with a depressed air. "Well," said Mr. Moody, "we don't want that kind of a mountaintop experience. When a man gets up so high that he cannot reach down and save poor souls, there is something wrong." Meetings were held in the seminary chapel, and also daily in a large tent on the green knoll near Mr. Moody's house, later known as Round Top, and now the burial place of the evangelist. The men met in this tent, and the women held their meetings in the seminary chapel. At the close of the morning meetings in the tent, other meetings were held in Bonner Glen, a shady ravine under the trees, and in the seminary. To many these meetings are still memorable, and will be, while life lasts. Dr. Hartzell refers to one meeting which he considers especially sacred. It was held in a large tent on Round Top. Under common impulse, the little company of 26 clasped one another's hands, stood in a circle, and entered into a solemn covenant of consecration with God and with one another. Someone proposed that each one take a list of the names and addresses of all, and that we pledge ourselves to pray daily for each other till death. "No," said Mr. Moody, "don't bind yourselves to do that. Pray for one another, of course, but don't pledge yourselves to do it every day, lest you burden your conscience and make an irksome duty out of what should be a delightful privilege." Some words of caution spoken by Mr. Moody at the close of this meeting may well be recalled at this time. Don't go away and talk so much about the meeting as about Christ. The world needs Him. Every place where God leads you, there is your field. Don't talk an inch beyond your experience. A holy life will produce the deepest impression. Lighthouses blow no horns. They only shine. Confessions should only extend to parties sinned against. Look out for the devil at the foot of the mountains. Among the interesting incidents of that meeting which had been received from friends, 2 are given. We were perhaps 100 men, seated on the clean straw under the tent at noon on Round Top. Mr. Moody was leading the conversation hour. He sat sturdily against the central tent pole. Out came the plump question. "Brethren, how many of you have so grown in grace that you can bear to have your faults told?" Many hands went up. Quick as a flash, but not sharp or insultingly, Moody turned to a young Episcopalian minister in front of him and said, "Brother, you have spoken 13 times in 3 days here, and perhaps shut out 12 other good men from speaking." The young man had been presuming. Mr. Moody fitted him fairly. He had held up his hand as one willing to be chided for fault, but he could not bear it. He owed no fault or sorrow, but stoutly defended himself, or tried to, only making his case really the worse. Then a real old Yankee vinegar face on the outer rim of the circle turned loose and sharply berated Mr. Moody for his bluntness. The good man blushed, but listened until the abuse was over. Then, suggestively covering his face, he spoke through his fingers. "Brethren, I admit all the fault my friend charges on me, but, brethren, I did not hold up my hand." At one of these meetings for Christian workers, Mr. Moody presented a very high ideal for the ministry, and spoke severely of those who failed in their sacred calling. His words were very pointed, and the young theologian who was present winced and spoke out ingenuously. "Mr. Moody, I don't see any such ministers as you describe." It was a frank and outspoken remonstration, but not rude. Quick as a flash came the retort. "You are a young man yet, but you will see many of them. Tarry in Jericho until your beard be grown." The reply was unjust and it hurt, yet there was too much life in the meeting for stopping. In writing of the scene, a friend says, "It went on with a clear sense that the evangelist had dropped a little from his standards of loving courtesy to his guest. He could have ignored it. The tide of his eloquence was full. Yet the most eloquent was to come. In my heart has ever since been a written memory which brings moisture into my eyes, and ranks itself unquestionably as the greatest thing I ever saw Mr. Moody do. Friends," he said, "I answered my dear young friend over there very foolishly as I began this meeting. I asked God to forgive me, and I asked the forgiveness of my brother." And straightway he walked over to him and took him by the hand. That meeting needed no after-meeting. It was dramatically and spiritually made perfect. The man of iron will proved that he had mastered the hardest words of all earth's languages. "I am sorry." The many testimonials of blessings that resulted from the first conference led Mr. Moody to call a second gathering the following year, which continued through the entire month of August. Dr. Andrew A. Bonner was the leading speaker on this occasion, and his impressions are thus given in his diary, recently published. August 4th, Northfield. Began yesterday, but especially today the conference took shape. Was requested to open, which I did, from Exodus 34, Communion with Gold, a gathering of God's people from every quarter. August 13th. Much exercised after gaining power from on high, about which much conversation. I am rather disappointed that there is not more prayer throughout the day, but the atmosphere is delightful. So much brotherly love, so much biblical truth, so much delight in whatever exalts Christ. August 14th. Preached on John 3:30. Mr. Moody as kind as possible, and most earnest in all work. When Mr. Moody was abroad in 1892, Dr. A.J. Gordon of Boston had charge of the meetings, and the following year, when the World's Fair campaign engrossed all of Mr. Moody's energies, Dr. Gordon, assisted by H.M. Moore, again conducted the conference. In 1891, the Reverend F.B. Mayor of London, a prominent speaker of the Keswick Conference in England, was present at Northfield, and the subjective side of Christian living received a special prominence. There was no advocacy of sinless perfection, but a clear presentation of the possibilities of a life truly yielded to God, and the privilege it afforded of living free from the bondage of sin. The message of this teacher was markedly fruitful in the lives and ministries of many who were present. Mr. Bear returned in succeeding years, and other English speakers have laid great emphasis of late on this line of teaching, including, among others, Prebendary Webb Preplow, Andrew Murray, and G. Campbell Morgan. There again Mr. Moody showed the sound judgment that guided his work, for he refused to limit the Northfield work to any one phase of Christian truth. Northfield was to be representative of all the truth contained in God's Word, and while giving due prominence to the importance of subjective dealing, he accompanied it with the lectures from the leading American ministers on methods of Christian work, Bible interpretation, and all the varied experiences of a wide and charitable conception of Christian thought and activity. Missionary interest have been presented by representatives of all lands, while city, frontier, and evangelistic work have received the due recognition they deserve. The wisdom of this course is amply proved by the continued growth of these conferences and the many testimonies received from those who have been blessed in attending them. For years, Stone Hall, the recitation hall of the Northfield Seminary, was used as the audience room for the summer conferences. But in time this became overcrowded, and in 1894 the beautiful auditorium on the crest of the hill overlooking the campus was erected, primarily for these gatherings. "I have always tried to build according to my faith," said Mr. Moody on the opening night. "This time my friends think my faith has carried me away. They do not believe that I shall ever see this building full." Within a week, on the first Sunday morning, seats, platforms, stairways, and aisles were filled with an audience numbering about 30,000, and this experience has been repeated every year. The following call, dated June 1st, 1899, was the last one that Mr. Moody issued. Dear friends and fellow workers, the 17th General Conference of Christian Workers will be held at Northfield, August 1st to 20th, and all of God's people who are interested in the study of His Word, in the development of their Christian lives, in a revival of the spiritual life of the Church, in the conversion of sinners, and in the evangelization of the world, are cordially invited to be present. I am glad to send out this invitation to my fellow workers, because I believe that such a gathering was never more needed than this year. Many thoughtful men have come to feel strongly that the hope of the Church today is in a deep and widespread revival. We are confronted with difficulties that can be met in no other way. The enemy has come in like a flood. It is a time for those who believe in a supernatural religion to lift up a standard against him. Oh, for a revival of such power, that the tide of unbelief and worldliness that is sweeping in upon us shall be beaten back. That every Christian shall be lifted to a higher level of life and power, and multitudes of perishing souls may be converted to God. Why not? God's arm is not shortened, nor His ear heavy. I believe the sound of the goings in the tops of the mulberry trees may already be heard. The history of revivals prove that such a work must begin at the house of God. Who can doubt that if somehow the Church could be thoroughly aroused, not a mere scratching of the surface of our emotions, but a deep heart work, that shall make us right with God and clothe us with power in His prayer and service, the last months of the century would witness the mightiest movement of the Holy Spirit since Pentecost. The whole aim of this conference is to help bring this about. Why need any pastor or church fail to share in this blessing? How sad the experience of that worker who sees others greatly used in such a movement, and himself pass by, other fields rejoicing with the joy of harvest, while he still lies barren and unfruitful. It need not be so. Let us break up our fallow ground, seek a fresh anointing of the Spirit, and then move forward, expecting great things of God. We are to have with us some of the most widely known teachers of this country and England, men on whose labors God has already set His seal. There will be the great help that comes from the closest contact with hundreds of earnest men and women, almost all of them engaged in some form of Christian work. The accommodations for boarding are ample and pleasant, and the expense moderate. I should be glad to hear from all who are planning to come. May I not ask Christian people to begin now to pray for a special outpouring of the Spirit upon every meeting of the conference? Yours in the Master's service, D.L. Moody. In response to this invitation, the largest gathering ever held in Northfield met the first 3 weeks of August. The Presbytery of New York engaged Weston Hall, and 60 of its pastors and members were entertained there, several accompanied by their wives. 3 or 4 of the leading pastors of the city were among the speakers in the auditorium and on Round Top. During the last August conference, Mr. Moody started a new work in establishing a week's conference for young people, in which he had the hearty cooperation of John Willis Bear of the United Society of Christian Endeavor. The gathering aimed to reach young people in the churches, and by informal conference advised the best methods of work. In another chapter, we have alluded to the development of the Students' Conference. The marked results of this gathering, as well as at the August conference, led the officers of the Young Women's Christian Association to institute a conference for young women, on lines similar to that for young men. This met for the first time in 1893, and has steadily increased in attendance and influence with succeeding years. The leading women's colleges are represented at the gathering by large delegations, as well as many of the leading young women's Christian associations. A new feature was introduced in 1899, which gave Mr. Moody great encouragement, and suggested a new phase of Northfield work. The Lowell Young Women's Christian Association has sent a large delegation to the conferences, and in the winter of 1898-99, it was proposed by the secretary, Miss Louise Pearson, to erect a house where 25 or 30 women could live at a slight expense and enjoy the advantages of Northfield. Between the seminary and Northfield Hotel, accordingly, Lowell Lodge was erected and opened on August 15, 1899. 25 self-supporting young women occupied this building during the Bible conference. Some of them boarded themselves, paying $1 a week for lodging, but the majority had their meals at the lodge, which cost $2 or $3 additional. In his address to this dedication, Mr. Moody said, "I am more than pleased with what has been accomplished here. We gave the land very gladly, because we believe it is going to open up a new plan, which I hope will be a great blessing not only to the town of Northfield, but to the country. If people see that such a house can be put up for $1,000, some of them will duplicate this one. We will furnish the land for nothing. If girls come here from Lowell and get stirred by God's Spirit so they go back and carry a blessing to others, we should be 1,000 times repaid for the little paltry land that we gave. We don't want a city in Northfield. We want to spread out. There is no reason why the whole mountainside should not be built up. The greatest trouble we have is to entertain people who come here. You can imagine that to have 1,200 extra people in a little town like this, as we have had for the last few days, makes somebody work. Now, if people will undertake to put up houses where they can board themselves, it would be a great relief. In that way, they can get a room and live on bread and milk and blueberries for about $2 a week. We don't ask them to come here to pamper the body, but to feed the soul. I believe the blessing of God is going to rest upon this building and those who come here. I think Northfield is just about as near paradise as we can get on earth." The Life of D.L. Moody, Chapter 33. A Visit to the Holy Land. As early as January 1887, Mr. and Mrs. Peter McKinnon, of Scotland, urged Mr. Moody to accompany them to Palestine. That the invitation touched a very sympathetic chord is evident from the response called forth. "My dear Mrs. McKinnon, yours of January 10th came today. I could hardly keep back the tears as I thought of going to Calvary, Gethsemane, and the Mount of Olives with you. My heart is with you, and I cannot tell you what a self-denial it is for me not to go. For years I have wanted to do so, and though I have never left my work for pleasure in my life, I think I should have gone this time if I had not been as I am. For 3 years they've been trying to get me to go to Chicago, and I told them that if they would do certain things, I would give them 3 months. They have done what I asked for them to do, and so I must stay here until April or May. I do long to take a trip, and would like to go with you and your husband, more than with anyone else. But I must decline for another thing. Mrs. Holton is dying, and I would go to her if I could get away. She is in California, and the letter that came last night says that she will not last 30 days, and I cannot go to her. Poor Fanny, how sad it is for her to lie down her work and die. But I am glad she is ready, and not dreading death as she once was. The sting is all gone, but it is so hard to die away from her sisters. Remember me to all our old friends, and think of me and pray for me in the garden, and on Olivet, and at Calvary, and take one good look when in Bethany, and see if you can see the place where the Master was once seen, and ask him to come back again. Thanking you again for your great kindness, yours as ever, D.L. Moody." In February 1892, the generous and cordial invitation was repeated. Mr. Moody was then engaged in Scotland, and it was impossible for him to leave his work. This was his response. Paisley, Scotland, February 10th, 1892. "My dear Mrs. McKinnon, I would be glad to go to Palestine, but there are some reasons that will keep me. First, the work. It would be a pity to leave it now, and I am committed until the 1st of April. Second, in April, when it grows warmer, I come down with headache and suffer a good deal unless I keep where it is cool. Third, my wife says that Palestine is said to be unhealthy, and no one can go there in the spring. So I think, if ever I see the land of Abraham and his children, I shall have to see it when I go in another body, and it may be I will see it with Christ himself. I cannot tell you how glad I am your husband is better. Tell him I pray for him daily, and trust it will be the will of God to lift him up again. I did not know I loved him so much until I heard he was sick. Mr. Sankey has gone up to London to attend the funeral of Mr. Spurgeon. They wanted me to go, but I could not get away. The churches, halls, etc., were all engaged, and this kept me. I am thankful to tell you the work is good here, and I have much to encourage me. Yet I get homesick at times, and long to see my family. May the blessing of God rest on you and your dear husband, is the prayer of your friend, D.L. Moody. A man of such energetic spirit as Mr. Moody found very little opportunity for holidays. He scarcely tried to observe one day in 7 as a rest day, but otherwise he was almost constantly occupied, except when journeying. And even then people recognized him and sought his spiritual advice, and were not denied. Of later years, with the multiplication of his schools, conferences, and other organizations for promoting the cause of Christ, there was less and less opportunity for withdrawing for any length of time from active participation in their control. Still anxious to carry out their plans, Mr. and Mrs. McKinnon deferred their trip until April, and finally prevailed on Mr. Moody to accompany them. Taking his wife and his son Paul, he went from Paris to Rome, where he was to join Mr. McKinnon's party. His interest in everything about him was intense, and, as usual, it centered particularly in the people and their methods of life. The farming on the hillside especially attracted his attention. To see men living in their little houses, perched like crows in a nest on the edge of the snow incline, reclaiming patches of land, some of them hardly 20 feet square, excited his wonder. He would frequently say, "Look here, see that hillside farming? That beats all I ever saw. If I ever hear a Northfield man complain of his farm again, I'll fall on him." This reference to his size caused much merriment. On their arrival at Rome, Mr. and Mrs. McKinnon joined the party, and after breakfast they made a tour of the city with a guide. Mr. Moody was unusually silent when going through the beautiful churches, speaking only occasionally. The Colosseum proved a great attraction. He sat on a huge column that was lying on the ground, and surveyed the amphitheater, calling up the various historical acts of the scenes of murder, cruelty, and martyrdom enacted there. A stalwart peasant passed by one of the corridors, and Mr. Moody stopped him. He said to Ortini, the guide. Ortini did so. The peasant beamed on all the party, and spoke rapidly in Italian. "What did he say?" asked Mr. Moody. "He said he was heavier, but he is losing flesh. He was too poor to drink wine. If he had wine, he would look sleek like you." "Tell him I am a teetotaler," said Mr. Moody. Ortini did so. The man smiled incredulously, as if such a thing was impossible. "Tell him it is true," said Mr. Moody. The man, still laughing, said, producing a loaf from beneath his coat, "You may be a teetotaler in drink, but you are no teetotaler in eating." The peasant said he only had 2 francs a day for his family of 7 children. Mr. Moody advised him to go to America, and then gave him a 2 francs piece. As the party passed on, the man called to the guide, and ran back, holding out the piece of money. "What is the matter?" said Mr. Moody. "He says it's the Pope's money, and is not good in Rome. Will you give him another piece?" Mr. Moody could hardly recognize that the Pope's silver was not good in Rome, but exchanged the piece of money for another. He was greatly impressed by the places of historical interest. Anything that had a touch of Paul's life in it moved him deeply. Every place that could be verified as being in any way connected with Mr. Moody's greatest Bible hero was carefully sought out. The Reverend J. Gordon Gray took him on the Appian Way, and when the original pavement was reached, Mr. Moody insisted on alighting from the carriage and going on foot over the stones which St. Paul had trodden as he entered Rome. The ruins of Nero's palace on the Palatine Hill had far more attraction for him than St. Peter's or any other spectacle of modern Rome. He seemed to take great delight in the many monuments which Rome had erected to Paul, saying that the emperors who tyrannized the earth were remembered only by ruins. When he visited St. Peter's, he spoke of the sad degradation of the communion service from the pure faith of the early church. In the evening, Mr. Moody preached in the Presbyterian church, of which Dr. Gray was pastor. About 130 people were present. The sermon delivered was the one he gave on the last night in Kansas City, on grace, from the text, "The grace of God that bringeth salvation," etc. Friday, April 8th, the party started for Naples, and sailed from there for Port Said, which was reached 4 days later. Writing from Port Said, Mr. Moody said, "We are now near where the children of Israel passed when they went out of Egypt. The land is sandy and barren, but the canal is a wonder, and it seems strange to be in this land of the Pharaohs, of Moses, and Aaron, and Joseph." After coaling the steamer at Port Said, they sailed on the Suez Canal to Ismaili. Little sleep was taken that night. About midnight they passed the old Syrian road at Kandara, where the ancient Jews and others traveled from Europe and Asia into Egypt, where, no doubt, Joseph was taken by the caravan. At Ismailia, a train was taken to Alexandria, the land of Goshen, full of interest to every Bible student. Mr. Moody's thirst for information was satisfied here as elsewhere by an early morning ride with the guide, before the rest of the party was up. At Alexandria, a boat was taken for Joppa. The Holy Land was sighted on Good Friday. The landing at Joppa was not made until late in the afternoon. The start was made for Jerusalem. Supper was eaten at Ramla. Mr. Moody finished before the rest and said he would go out into the air. When the party was ready to start, he was nowhere to be seen, and calling failed to reach him. The carriages were entered, and after a while he was overtaken. He had informed the guide that he was going on before, but was now beginning to be frightened, as he had seen several dark-looking Arabs scowling as they passed and spitting at him, and he thought it wiser to take the carriage. The moon rose brightly over the mountains as the carriages drove on. About 1 o'clock a cup of coffee was served at Kolonaya. Active signs of life were seen along the road. Caravans with camels, heavily laden, passed many times. Jerusalem was reached at 3 o'clock Saturday morning, and after a few hours' rest a walk was taken about the city, out to the tomb of David, alongside of which was a little house, where, in an upper chamber, it is said that the Master ate the Last Supper. Mr. Moody was incredulous on all the traditional sights seen in Jerusalem, except the temple and Calvary. He said that most of the localities were obscure, but the hills you cannot change nor remove. Dr. George D. Mackey of New York, who joined the party on the trip, says of his first day in the Holy City, "One walk around Zion Hill, finished at the Joppa Gate. Just before reaching it we saw a group of lepers. The sight was pitiful in the extreme. The thought of contamination was uppermost, and we hurried by, anxious to pass such misery. In the afternoon, Paul, Donald, Miss Mac's son, got donkeys and rode to the top of the Mount of Olives. On the way we passed Calvary." Mr. Moody took his Bible early Easter morning and went to the Mount of Olives. In the afternoon he preached to a large audience on Calvary under the auspices of the English Church Missionary Society. At least 300 people were present, largely native and visiting Christians. Some Muslims and Jews came to listen, attracted by the crowd. Mr. Moody was in excellent spirits and preached with an emotion that he had rarely, if ever, equaled in any previous sermon. He hardly chose a text, beginning by saying that he had preached for 30 years, but had never felt the awe of God that he did at the moment. Point out the various spots in sight and link them with their stories in the Bible. Mizpah and Samuel, Moriah and Abraham, the distant hills of Moab and Ruth, all of it in Jesus. He likened the sacrifice of Isaac to the coming offering up of Jesus, and spoke of how Jesus must have felt as he passed this hill in boyhood, knowing that there he should offer up his life. He spoke of the feasts that Jesus had attended on yonder temple site, and how the burden of his preaching, each one, was a new birth in the power of the Spirit, and closed after saying that the greatest blessing of his life had been the birth in the Spirit, by an appeal to every Christian person to seek God, until the baptism of the Spirit should be as a fire in their hearts, like that called down by Elijah on the Mount of Carmel. The sermon was preached with a fervor beyond description, and left an impression on all who heard it. A collection was taken at the conclusion for the London Jews' Society School, where scholars, in number about 80 boys and girls, attended the meeting. The weekdays were spent in visiting places of interest in Jerusalem and the immediate vicinity. One day was devoted to Hebron. In Jerusalem, all the sacred spots, like the Holy Sepulchre, were too uncertain or too transformed to please him. On Monday, the party went to Bethlehem and Solomon's Pools. At Bethlehem they drank at the well so dearly loved by David, and photographed a group of Arabs at the curb. There they saw the hills where, no doubt, David tended his flocks and wrote many of the Psalms, and also the field of Boaz and the shepherd's field. Later they visited the church of the Nativity. Mr. Moody's favorite place was the Mount of Olives, to which he repeatedly returned, and the little village of Bethany, over the brow of the hill. Here, at any rate, he knew he was in the midst of scenes where the Master had often walked. When he went to Bethany with Mrs. Moody and Mr. and Mrs. McKinnon and Miss Love, their arrival was celebrated as usual. A horde of children were sent, as a general reception committee, to extract from the visitors what bakish they could in way of silver, copper, lead, and zinc, which the coin of the Turkish realm furnished in such infinite and deceptive variety. Some pretended blindness or deafness to work on the visitors' pity. Others carried babies. Those little chubby hands were hardly big enough to clutch the coin they held them out for. They immediately surrounded Mr. Moody. He was always generous. On this occasion especially so, because of the unusual nature of the place and its beautiful tradition. He asked if any of them had the name of Mary or Martha, and was agreeably surprised to learn that a number of them had. This opened his pockets again. The news of his generosity rapidly spread through the village, and new faces and hands were immediately added to the crowd, all surging about him in frantic effort to get the lion's share of the spoils. He was besieged. They swarmed on every side. "Bakshish! Gift money! Bakshish!" they cried. It was difficult to move. The visit to Bethany was rapidly converting itself into a fight for existence. The case was getting desperate, so he called a truce. He told the dragoman to ask them to be quiet while he made an address. He did so. Then Mr. Moody talked, and the dragoman interpreted. He said in substance, "I have come 6,000 miles to see this little village of Bethany. It was a place my master loved to visit, and I have come to see it because he loved it. I am glad to meet you all, and I hope you will grow up to be good men and good women. Now I want to be alone. I have no more bakshish, and I bid you all goodbye." A fine-looking boy, about 16 years old, said he wanted to reply to the address. He spoke fluently and with the grace of an orator. He said, "We are glad to see the gentleman and his friends who have come so far. But the gentleman must not think that his actions are equal to the importance of his visit. 6,000 miles is a long way to come, and the gentleman must have sacrificed much to make the visit. In consequence, it is natural for us to expect that he would be munificent in his gifts of bakshish, which he has not been. We expect that he will now give a great deal more." Mr. Moody, who had regarded with surprise and delight the eloquence and grace of the boy, was so disgusted at the conclusion that he took flight. "I did think that boy had a soul above bakshish," he said. Someone casually asked Mr. Moody whether he thought any of these children were named Mary or Martha. "Certainly. Why not?" "Nothing. Only they were all boys." Mr. Mackey thus describes the visit to the Mosque of Omar. "In the mosque we all wore felt slippers, which they tied on over our shoes. Mr. McKinnon carried a pair of slippers and put them on. This is necessary, as no heathen foot must touch the sacred floor. However, Paul Moody's slippers came off, and to our consternation he was discovered by one of the mosque officials to be tramping about with his infidel foot bared to the sole of a shoe. The scene that followed was enough to terrify him. The air was full of Arabic indignation. There was a rushing and a scolding and a wild excitement that was growing decidedly distressing. Paul stood holding his foot up so that he would not further contaminate the floor. His mother, pale, all nervous, was assisting him, and looked as if she would give anything to get out alive. Arabs began to assemble and jabber ferociously. Meanwhile, some wise attendant had got a new pair of slippers, and when Paul was reshod, we began to breathe freely, especially as we saw the Arabs were growing calmer and apparently were going to work no vengeance. My own shoe was peering through the wearing felt, and I began to feel squeamish myself when I thought about the exposure of one half of the sole of my shoe, which was visible every step I took, might repeat the scene we had just gone through. One morning at 5 o'clock, in company with Mr. Mackey, Mr. Moody went to the Mount of Olives. It rained, and as they ascended, a beautiful rainbow spanned the city. Its base rested on the temple court at one end, and just beyond the gate of Herod at the other. It looked like a rainbow of promise of the glory to come at Jerusalem. Mr. Moody was surprised when they reached the crest of the mountains, as he had not expected to see such a glorious view of the hills of Judea, the Dead Sea, and the Jordan Valley. He was greatly delighted. Their special quest was the Mount of Ascension, as neither was satisfied with the spot shown. On the Bethany spur of the mountain the two travelers read again the story of Lazarus and the ascension of Jesus. Together they prayed, Mr. Moody pleading with the Lord to come again quickly, and to sanctify their visit to that spot by their growth in grace. He was deeply moved, and prayed most fervently. It was fully 11 o'clock when they returned, having been nearly 5 hours on the mountain. In the afternoon they went to the Jews' Wailing Wall and the Pool of Siloam. When it rained, Mr. Moody sent for 2 members of the London Jew Society, who called at the hotel, and for 2 hours he and the rest of the party, who wished to do so, plied them with questions about the interesting points in Jerusalem. Once, seeing some poppies on the east temple wall, he said, "Look here, drops of blood, a symbol of the blood shed for sin. It seems as though the ground itself is testifying of Christ against the unbelief of the city." The native children of Jerusalem amused him greatly. On his exit from the hotel he would invariably be surrounded by a crowd of ragged little Arabs, and entertain himself by giving them bakshish. The older natives interested him also, and he conversed with them constantly, questioning them as to their habits. But at the end of the week he was well informed as to the manner of the life of the people, the condition of agriculture, the system of government, and a dozen other things. On his second Sunday in Jerusalem, Mr. Moody was up at 4 o'clock to see the sun rise on the Mount of Olives. He wanted to see the sun come up beyond the hills of Moab. His visit was successful, and he joined his party at breakfast much pleased. He said that he had seen the sun rise, and that as he looked over this land of promise, in his imagination he saw Moses' face, surrounded by the sun as a halo. He was in ecstasies over the beautiful eastern view from the Mountain of Olives, the valley of the Jordan, the Dead Sea, the hills of Moab, all seemingly only 5 miles away, although more than 20. In the afternoon, Mr. Moody preached beneath Calvary on the west. There was a rumor that the government had forbidden any Turkish subject to attend the meeting at Calvary under pain of arrest, but there was no truth in it. The Mohammedans had criticized Mr. Moody's preaching from a tombstone in their cemetery the previous Sunday. Mr. Moody said, "I don't blame them. I wouldn't want any man to stand on my father's grave to preach a sermon." The truth was that the cemetery on Calvary was such a dilapidated affair that the visitors took it for a deserted cemetery, as indeed it was. Mr. Moody preached on the Good Samaritan to an audience about as large as that of Easter Day. At the close of the sermon he announced that on the previous Sunday the collection was £20, although he had only asked for 10. He now wanted £10 more for a blind boy to go into the Church Missionary Society's school for a year. The hat was passed, and again £20 was raised. On Monday morning, Mr. and Mrs. Moody and Paul went again to the Mount of Olives, and at noon they started for Joppa. "Thus ends my 3 weeks with Mr. Moody," wrote Mr. Mackey. "It has been a blessed experience for me." Mr. McKinnon's party then returned to Egypt. Several days were spent in Cairo visiting the pyramids and other points of interest, and in the first week of May the party started for Italy. May was spent in Naples and Florence, the Italian lakes and Switzerland, and by the end of the month Mr. Moody was again in England, having been absent for 2 months, probably the largest vacation he had ever taken since he had entered business as a boy of 17. It was not an unbroken rest, however, for he had preached in Rome, Jerusalem, Cairo, Naples, and Paris, and sometimes twice a day, besides conducting numerous Bible readings, to gratify the importunities of English and American friends, who recognized him wherever he went. Moreover, he used to lead the most unlikely people on the most unlikely occasions into direct personal talk regarding their spiritual condition. "Mr. Moody," said a lady of rank, "no one ever talked to me like this before." Then it was quite time somebody did so, he replied, and they remained good friends thereafter. His visit to the Holy Land remained a vivid, living memory. He constantly referred to it in the private conversation and public discourse, regretting on the one hand that the present mean condition of Palestine, which, however, he believed was in accord with prophecy, and on the other, looking forward with joy to its restoration, when the feet of the Messiah shall once again stand on all of it. To learn more about God's peculiar people, visit the links in the description.